Welcome to this webinar, or indeed panel discussion, on careers for sustainability and climate action, part of INSEAD's 2020 SDG Week and organized by the Student Club for Climate Action, which we know is SDG 13. So of all the sustainability challenges that the world faces, climate change is undoubtedly the most pressing. The UN has estimated that in order to keep the global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees centigrade, we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half over the next 10 years and aim to become carbon neutral by around 2050. These are obviously very ambitious goals, and achieving them will require fairly drastic transition in not only the energy sector, but in industry, transportation, buildings, and cities, to name just a few. Service sectors like finance and consulting will also be impacted through the very important role that they play in supporting businesses in making that transition, be it through management advice or by providing capital. So it's very clear that climate change will be a key business issue for many companies in the next 2 or 3 decades. And in fact, there's a broader range of sustainability issues beyond climate change, so both environmental and social, that will only grow in importance for business in the years to come, and simply actually continuing a trend that we are already observing. So in this webinar, what we hope to do is to explore how climate change and the low carbon transition, and in fact sustainability more broadly, is impacting careers, business careers. So we want to look at some new careers, some new roles that are specifically linked to sustainability, but we also want to understand how sustainability is increasingly being integrated into traditional business careers. My name is Lucy Tepler. I'm a finance professor at INSEAD, and I first integrated sustainability and climate change into my career when I started teaching a course on sustainable finance about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm delighted to be joined on this panel by 2 of our alumni, Kaori Shigeya and Bruno Berton. So Kaori is a graduate from, I believe, 2001 or 2002, and since 2018, she has been working for the UNPRI as a senior specialist for SDGs. The UNPRI, this is the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, is an organization or network of large investors and asset managers who define common principles for integrating sustainability into investment decision making, and with an overall objective of contributing to sustainability in the global financial system. It currently has about 3,000 members with over 100 billion US dollars of assets under management. Do I mean 100 trillion? I think I meant 100 trillion. My apologies. And then Bruno, who graduated in the 90s and for the last 20 years has been with Accenture, who is the partner for INSEAD's SDG Week. He is currently Senior Managing Director working in utilities mostly, but about 10 years ago, he founded the very successful Sustainability Services Group at Accenture, focusing on sustainability strategy, sustainability performance measurement, energy and resource efficiency, and intelligent cities. So welcome to you both. So turning to my 2 panelists, so I thought we would start with some background. So both of you, when you left INSEAD, it was quite a while ago, you started off in fairly traditional post-MBA careers, but now have ended up with roles in sustainability. So I'd like to understand a bit better how you made that transition. So let me kick off with Bruno. So Bruno, you were already working at Accenture when you launched this Sustainability Services Group. So firstly, what prompted you to do this, and how easy or difficult was it to drive this change in the organization?
Thank you, Lucy. First of all, making sure that you hear me well. So far, so good. So yes, I've launched the sustainability practice, I think it was 2006. I had been with Accenture since 95, right? So I had, started a traditional career in strategy consulting. What happened, I was in charge of growth and strategy for our consulting business. And at the time, sustainability was becoming a hot topic. And the question that was raised to me was, is that an area where we should sort of invest? Should Accenture become a player in sustainability consulting to me? When I came back with the response and where I saw the opportunity, then my boss at the time, who was leading consulting globally, asked me to actually sort of take that responsibility on and launch the practice, which we did, and I led it for about 10 years, and it's sort of continuing. And I think our new CEO has actually sort of reinforced the commitment of Accenture in that particular space. I think the question that was interesting at the time was not to be in sustainability for the sustainability's sake. It was trying to understand where the business opportunity was. And as you said, I'm now working in utilities, and the reason for that is that an industry like utilities is very much transformed by the zero carbon target emissions for commitment, as well as the technology trend, digital, and I'll sort of come back to that, right? So when we started, I think what was interesting is that a lot of people were, I would say, militants, and I think the big risk was that you had a few players in the sustainability consulting space. You had basically auditors that were doing, basically the performance reporting or the sustainability reporting. I think many of the strategy players are trying to figure out what to do with carbon, including sort of McKinsey, but not with a lot of real opportunities. And so we tried to figure out what would be the right architecture, and we saw the link with energy and resources in general. We saw the link with technology, and I'll come back to that. And we started sort of shaping a wider sort of a look at the overall impact of sustainability and how to connect, the practice, which was, internally the ambassadors of the topic, to the real business opportunities by industry. And this is what has changed the most, I would say, in the last, 10 years. But that was sort of a long introduction. So I'm still sort of a, practitioner leading strategy globally, because I believe now that sustainability is a huge differentiator, or, a huge strategic orientation for industries like energy, utilities, but also consumer goods, retail, or automotive.
Great, thank you. I've lost Bruno's image, but I hope that we were able to hear what he told us about his background in getting to this point in his career in terms of sustainability. So with that, I'll switch to Kaori. So unlike Bruno, you took quite a different path in moving from a traditional post MBA career into a very focused role, in fact, in sustainability. So unlike Bruno, you didn't stay with one employer, you changed employer, in fact, multiple times. So can you tell us something about that journey and maybe some important lessons you learned along the way?
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for having me at INSEAD. I loved my time there, so I'm so excited to be invited back. And just to make the point that when I was at INSEAD and when I graduated, I had no idea that I would end up being sustainability. And when I was there, there was no Social Innovation Center, there was no Hoffman Global Institute. So I'm so excited to see this happening since I left. So I graduated from INSEAD in 2002, but it wasn't really until 2007, during the financial crisis, that I became really interested in sustainability. At that time, I was working at Lehman Brothers, and I became quite disillusioned before it collapsed that I really wanted to do something a little bit more purposeful with my work than just helping structures come up with really complicated products. And I consulted my boss at that time. And because it was 2007, he advised me that changing jobs at the time was a bit risky. I'm not sure if that was a wise advice because I stayed at Lehman Brothers in the end. He basically told me to start attending talks and events outside of my work time to find out what I'm really interested in. So I started attending talks, and my turning point was when I attended a sustainability conference at the OECD at my own expense, and I took holidays to go and attend there, I realized that that's an area that I really wanted to learn more about, particularly as it applies to finance. And after the Lehman collapse, I became more and more convinced that sustainability is critical to actual business survival. And after Lehman collapsed, I was lucky enough to be transferred to Nomura. And for about 1 year during the integration process of the merger, the market was down and the work was very quiet. So I spent that time trying to read up on sustainability and educating myself on sustainable finance. And while at Nomura, with the support of the same boss, I spent several years trying to campaign internally to integrate ESG issues into business practice. Like talking to equity research, say, maybe we should incorporate into equity research, or talking to investment bankers to say maybe we should incorporate into underwriting criteria, or talking to compliance departments, say, maybe we should include it in your client onboarding criteria, for example. And there was no sustainability person at Nomura at the time. So I ended up doing de facto sustainability role, even though it wasn't my official role. Sadly, there was no real senior buying at that time. And then my supportive boss left. My new boss told me that I should stop working on this sustainability nonsense. And this is when I realized that I needed to leave and work for an organization that truly embraced sustainability. And luckily, this new boss made me redundant, which meant that I had the time to explore and gain experience. So I signed up to an impact investing course and volunteered as an impact investing analyst for various organizations, including UK Impact Fund. And I did work experience as an intern, and I probably was the oldest intern at that time. And that was a really valuable experience, because I then realized that actually impact investing was not for me, because I found it too detailed and too small and too micro orientated. I'm sure it appeals to lots of other people, but for me, what interested me more was to make a difference at the more macro level and to make the mainstream investments more sustainable. So as I did not have a formal sustainable finance experience, it was difficult for me to get into a sustainable finance role, especially at the time there was not many roles around. And I eventually got a role as a financial sector advisor at a charity called Oxfam, which ended up being a perfect role for me. The role involved trying to influence the financial sector at a more systemic level. For example, engaging with investors about the human rights performance of their investee companies. And I loved working for Oxfam, but unfortunately the salary didn't pay my bills. And I needed to find work somewhere which was halfway between a charity and a corporate. And that's how I ended up at the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which enables me to use my previous experiences of working in finance, legal, charity sectors, and combining my passion for sustainable finance. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
It's a very impressive journey, and some of you may know that Kaori was profiled precisely because of this journey in the FT on the, I think it was the 10-year anniversary of the Lehman collapse. So yes, thank you both for introducing us to how you got into sustainability. So now the next logical question is really understanding a bit more about what your day-to-day job entails. So Kaori, I'll start with you this time. So you work for the UNPRI. It's an organization that is specifically focused on sustainability, albeit in investment decision making. And your title is Senior Specialist for SDGs. So it'd be interesting to hear from you what that role is. And then also another question related to the UNPRI. This is an organization that was set up, I think, back in 2006 by Kofi Annan, then UN General Secretary. And it formulated 6 principles for responsible investing that have been in place ever since. But then in 2015, the SDGs come along. So how did the UNPRI integrate the SDGs? So clearly you have a role specifically around the SDGs. And could you maybe say a few things on SDG 13, climate action in particular?
Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with the PRI, so as Lucy explained, it's like a membership organization. We have 3,000 investors who are members, who are asset owners and investment managers and service providers. And service providers are like the likes of MSCI or investment consultants who advise the investment managers and asset owners. And PRI was set up to help investors incorporate ESG issues into investment process. And what the SDGs have done is really change the perspective of how we view investments. So ESG was broadly about understanding how the environmental, social, and governance factors affect your portfolio performance from a risk and return perspective. In other words, how do external factors affect your portfolio? So outside in perspective. While the SDGs brought a new perspective that we also need to understand how our own portfolio affect external factors like the environmental, social factors. So having an inside out perspective. And it's been a bit of a journey. So what does that actually mean for investors? And it's taken a few years working with our advisory committee. So we have around 36 investors who sit on our SDG advisory committee. And to figure out, okay, what does that actually mean in practice for investors? And we just came up with our high-level framework, which we published in June this year, which explains that a PRI's view that if investors want to contribute to the SDGs, then we must firstly understand what outcomes our investments have on the real world, and then to try to improve them by increasing the positive and decreasing the negative outcomes. And I just wanted to highlight one differentiating factor with impact investments is impact investments often focus only on the positive outcomes and often neglect the negative. And our view is that negative outcomes is just as important as increasing the positive. And also we are trying to work with the mainstream investors. So we have 3,000 investors who are on a different journey of sustainability. And often, we have the different geographical spread with different beliefs about what investors should do and shouldn't do. So we really wanted to mainstream this concept and approach. In terms of what my day-to-day role entails, so it's one of my role really is to raise awareness amongst investors about why SDGs are relevant to them. So a lot of the European investors who are, I guess, more progressive already are on a journey to incorporating SDGs, so they don't need to be convinced why SDGs are important to them. But a lot of other investors around the world, especially in the US and Asia and in other regions, they still need some work convincing why SDGs are important and relevant to them. So I do this through speaking at conferences, webinars, and having one-to-one meetings with investor members. And that's the first role. Second role is for more advanced members who actually want to get on with implementing SDGs into their investment practice, but they don't really know how. So we work with the more progressive, advanced investors to come up with case studies, so practical case studies on how the advanced signatories have started to incorporate the outcome focus and SDGs into their investment practice, and showcase that to other investors who want to learn how to implement it in practice. And the third role is to write this into a guidance document so that people can learn at their own pace. And then lastly, PRI requests investors to report to us every year on how they are implementing this into their practice. So we request them to report to us and assess how they are doing. And then on your last point about SDG 13 on climate change, when it comes to outcome focus, actually, climate change is one of the more advanced areas where there are outcome metrics like CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions reduced. And also there are targets because of the Paris Agreement. So you know how much you need to reduce by. So we often use climate change as an example of how investors can become more outcome focused. We do have challenges that a lot of other SDGs, particularly the social ones, currently do not have sufficient outcome metrics and definitely not enough globally agreed thresholds. So it's difficult to know, okay, if you are, say, for example, increasing healthcare service or education service, what is actually adequate? You can say that you are improving, but is that improving good enough or fast enough? And in order to assess that, we need some globally or regionally or nationally agreed thresholds like the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
To follow up on that one, maybe we could take climate action as a specific example. So you interact a lot with investors and asset managers. Do you also work with the companies that obviously are responsible to some extent for reducing those emissions?
Yes, so that's a really good point. So normally we work mainly with investors because there's so many other organizations that work with companies that we don't want to tread in their on their turf, as it were. However, for investors, what's really important is the reporting that we receive from companies. So it is true that we can't really progress on this issue without having a dialogue with companies. So it's one of the reasons why PRI just joined forces with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, because they are mainly focused on engaging with companies. So instead of us approaching companies directly, we are partnering with other organizations who is focused on engaging with companies on sustainability issues to try to, I guess, standardize and uniformize the reporting by companies, because there are so many reporting requests going to companies that they are causing a lot of, administrative time burden on the companies. And we really need to come up with a uniform, standardized, meaningful, outcome-focused reporting. So it's one of the ambitions for us to work with, work towards this objective.
Great. So in terms of working directly with the companies, so here I'd like to switch back to Bruno, if he is with us. Bruno, are you online with us?
I should be. Do you see me?
So I can't see you yet, but we can hear you. So great. So in your case, then, although you set up, wonderful, and we can now see you too. So you set up the Sustainability Services Group, but now you work in utilities. And when we had a conversation a week or so ago, you actually told me that you work mostly on digital strategy, digital transformation. So in your current job, what is the link to sustainability and climate action? You know?
Okay, I seem to have sort of issues with connection. So I'm trying to move to a better spot. But if I heard the question correctly, is what does it mean for me today working for an industry like utilities? The reason why I, after sort of setting up the organization, one of the things that started happening to me was to work more regularly with the whole sort of sector of resources, energy, utilities, and the like, because it's a sector that has huge issues related to carbon emissions in particular, and therefore that's where a lot of our work, consulting work, was being targeted around renewable strategy, around energy efficiency, of course, KPIs, etc. So many of the organizations that Kerry was talking about were the organization that we work with the sustainability practice, plus the World Economic Forum. But what I was trying to do, moving into the industry, was trying to figure out how to shape the energy transition for our clients. Energy transition is the sort of the topic or the name that has been used to talk about the transformation of that particular sector and the impact of renewables, etc. So that's really the main focus, and it represents a huge sort of dimension, let's say, of the transformation of that industry. One of my clients was talking about the 3Ds to define the future of utilities: decarbonize, decentralize, and digitize, right? And so that's a perfectly sort of sweet spot for the type of work we do at Accenture, combining sort of strategy consulting and technology. And so that has become, over the years and for the last 4 or 5 years, my main focus. In parallel to that, I sit on the Sustainability Advisory Council of SAP, for example, so where I do sort of maintain that role of an ambassador of sustainability for one of our large partners, a high-tech company, which is very ambitious in that particular space, which is a way to stay sort of in touch, let's say, with that overall context from a regulatory standpoint and from a strategic ambition standpoint. And so by sort of participating to the interview, I just wanted to highlight that combination. You can sort of look into sustainability as a field of experts, and either sort of sustainable finance, being expert in that space, everything related to performance management, related to all the indicators, the organization that Kerry was talking about, are purely sort of focused on that, which is what are the drivers of climate change improvement at the worldwide basis. And there is a very, very strong sort of orientation around KPIs, whatever they are, measurement and commitment, right? Which is one area. It's not sort of only public policy, but it's even within organization, it is very much sort of in connection with either external reporting or internal management. There's another sort of space which is quite sort of interesting, which is how you bring sustainability into the business issues. The example that I was mentioning for utilities, which is energy transition, which is figuring out therefore how you bring in the go-to-market approach of my clients, sustainability as a differentiator, how my clients can contribute in the work they do to improving the planet, to participate, to protecting biodiversity, participating to reducing carbon emissions for their clients in area like zero waste, circular economy, as I said, energy efficiency, energy management, renewables, etc. Right, which is sort of being in the space of business, but with a very, very strong focus on sustainability. And I think those two elements, which are, if we look at the way Accenture works, there is a sustainability practice which drives this competency internally, which also has that sort of a representation role externally at the World Economic Forum, which contributes to our internal commitments, which is also what I see when I sit on advisory boards. And you have, the theme sort of picking up industry by industry as a key driver of the main, functional and strategic orientation of those businesses. Energy transition for utilities, energy. Everything related to the branding when it comes to consumer goods, everything related to, let's say, the access or the offer when it comes to retail. If we look at industry like automotive, it's going to be around e-mobility and combination of both e-vehicles and zero emissions sort of programs, etc. And I think this is a way to illustrate for INSEAD MBAs of the variety of options. There's one option which is to be a sustainability specialist in a variety of sectors or function, finance, supply chain, as I said, reporting, etc. And there is a way to bring that topic and that theme into the core business, industry by industry and or function by function. And my strong belief is that a leader in the business sort of tomorrow will have to internalize the sustainability obligation, the climate change obligation, maybe something wider, which we talk about Accenture as business responsibility, which includes issues related to the people, inclusion, diversity, localization of employment, etc. Right? But so I think that's what makes, let's say, the ambition and the perspective for a future leader at INSEAD particularly exciting, is that combination of these externalities, as they were called in sort of the early days, with the core business focus.
Thank you. So I think you've actually already answered what was going to be my follow-up question, which is what advice would you give to somebody graduating now with an MBA, let's say going into strategy consulting, who is undecided between whether they should be more focused on sustainability or a particular business sector, but integrating sustainability into that work?
Yeah, I would sort of describe that as, it's a choice between a militant in a political party and just being a supporter, right? Is that if it is the core ambition is really to spend your entire sort of life within that topic, to dedicate yourself to the church of sustainability, and jokingly, but in a positive way, then it's trying to figure out how to join either international organization like Yuri that are focused on the sustainability priority, or to get into the teams that are driving that internally for any kind of business that you're interested in. Can be a bank if it's and it's going to be sort of the sustainable investment approach. If it's as I said, an energy company, it's going to be around emissions, etc. Right? So that's one option, and which is very much this sort of militant route. I think what is new, because I don't think it existed in definitely not in my time, and probably not even in Kerry's time, is to bring that focus and priority and ambition into any area of the business that you're interested in, and that's going to be therefore embracing the renewables agenda in energy, embracing the sort of zero emissions vehicles in the automotive industry. It's going to be bringing all those values into the branding if you're into marketing, right? And so the variety of options is quite wide. I wouldn't, when I have that conversation, which I've had sort of very recently with alum or soon to be graduated, I mean, the choice between the two is very much around that sort of passion. I think it's quite sort of natural for a graduate in particular to want to be into that area more specifically now, but you can probably sort of combine both. I would say what I find the more exciting in the future of business is the ability to actually bring those opportunities, obsessions, whatever you call them, into the core business, from finance to politics, from marketing to supply chain, etc. And that's something that is particularly sort of interesting, right? And I personally think that is if you add that as a component of your overall business, I think it's a richness in terms of your potential career. If you're already convinced it is your area where you want to spend your time, then go for it now.
Absolutely agreed. Kauri, maybe in finance, it's a special situation, because whereas sustainable investing, responsible investing used to be something that was kind of a niche on its own, now it's sort of mainstream almost in finance. So is there even a distinction left in finance between the roles that are truly about sustainability versus sustainability just being integrated throughout all manner of finance careers?
Yeah, so I agree with what Bruno said, and also with your question. I was so excited that you created a sustainable finance elective course, but I think we need to mainstream it, so it needs to be in the main finance curriculum. So I hope that INSEAD would take the next step for that. Yeah, so from sustainable finance and investment kind of recruitment point of view, it it so I'm just talking from my experience at the PRI. We hire two types of candidates. So one type of candidate, we really want to have the mainstream financial experience, because we really need people who understand how the financial system works, how the investment process works, and how that they have the language and understanding to be able to communicate with our investors, signatories in a credible manner. We're not just a fluffy CSR sustainability organization. So we really value mainstream finance experience. Is one point. The difficulty, though, is that we pay much less than in the finance industry. So we actually find it quite difficult to find people with real finance experience to join us. And then the second type of people we hire are the so-called issue specialists or experts. So they have expertise in human rights issues, or they have issues, expertise in environment or deforestation and so forth. So these are the two kind of broadly speaking types of candidates that we tend to recruit. So I think, as Bruno says, there's so many options now. When I was looking, there weren't many, but now there are so many options. So you can, I'm sure, find some areas or particulars of interest that you really want to pursue. So if you are in a traditional role and you want to move to a sustainability role, then my advice is to start attending courses, volunteering, so that you can start to populate your CV with the relevant experience, even if it's not your official role, and you'll be able to talk about it at an interview. Also, it will help you decide what areas of sustainability that you want to go into, because there's so many different areas of sustainability now that sometimes you need to kind of try it to really be sure if it's for you or not, because the grass is not always greener. Yes, I think there was one more thing I wanted to say, but I've now forgotten.
Thank you. So actually, following up on that, you said in terms of kind of figuring out what works best for you in sustainability, what you're most interested in, you should take courses. Is there something that INSEAD or other business schools, in fact, should be doing? Obviously, we have a different curriculum now than 20 or 30 years ago when you and Bruno were at INSEAD. But when you interview recent graduates, then where do you think are the holes in their education, business or otherwise, in terms of really understanding sustainability?
So just from my experience, I attended this impact investing course run by this university based in California. And what I found was useful is that it's only a 2-week course, but they try to match you with a work experience in impact investment. So that's one reason why I managed to get a impact investing volunteering experience working for the UN Clean Cook Stove initiative. So I think you kind of really need to get really in there and get your hands dirty to really understand what it's really like. So I find that really useful. And yeah, I think just start volunteering, whether it's for work experience, interns, or any of these initiatives, to just it really increases your knowledge and also gives you confidence when it comes to getting a job interview, that you actually have some real experience that you can talk about.
Thank you. So maybe now for the last 15 minutes or so, we can go to some questions, and I'm going to start actually with one of my own that I hadn't prepared for this panel discussion. And for those of you who are hoping to get away from the US election by attending this webinar, I'm sorry, I'm going to mention it. Today is the day that the US actually, sadly, has officially now withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. We don't know how that will play out over the next weeks, months, or years ahead even. But in terms of what you're doing, the SDG goals, the carbon neutrality that we're shooting for in 2050, do you see anything happening actually with people you're interacting with in terms of that decision? So maybe here I can switch back to Bruno. Will companies behave any differently depending on who is in the White House in terms of sustainability?
So I think large organizations, and Accenture works mostly with large corporations, have not sort of changed their orientation. So if you look at either very large companies worldwide or large US companies, in most cases they have committed to climate change targets. I mean, the entire Silicon Valley is, extremely sort of committed, which is a way to say that California doesn't necessarily sort of vote the same way as the rest of the US. I think you can sort of say the same with, other, business area, like, pharmaceuticals, like the financial community and in centers like New York. So for large organization, I would say there's a relatively sort of, limited impact of that decision. There's always a few exceptions. If we look at the oil and gas industry, I think there's been a very good article on Exxon as an exception, which is the only sort of player in that industry that is still sort of fully committed to increasing production of oil. But even for that particular industry, if I take a very large local player like Total, I mean they have already committed to rotating their portfolio towards less emissions. So that's just first comment. Obviously it does have an impact in the rest of the local network of a specific country, particularly sort of mid-sized businesses. The absence of a carbon price has an impact in towards specific commitments to energy efficiency, for example. Obviously, in the US, when it comes to shale gas, oil, or any kind of sort of new form of fuel that makes a difference, and it already did in the last 4 years, right? So there's a bit of a dichotomy. The world of big business, I would say, relatively sort of immune, but obviously then a local network, it's quite different. And some of the regulatory levers, which have a big impact in terms of incentives towards renewables, in terms of, I said, carbon price, you won't see that necessarily in the US in the next 4 years, depending on what happens in the next few hours. While it's clearly sort of different in New Zealand, in Europe, in a few other places, right?
And in Corey, in your case, then the kind of investors and asset managers you deal with, I believe they are firmly committed to sustainability. So this will have no impact, or in fact, it could actually even increase engagement.
Yes, exactly that. We've actually found more, I guess, investors feeling that they need to take more action to put pressure on companies to reduce carbon emissions in the absence of the US leadership. So actually, I think it's increased investor interest and action in this area.
So some questions from the audience now. The first one here is for you, Corey. You had mentioned this pay gap that exists for roles, at least in the finance industry, that like yours are not necessarily within traditional asset managers or banks. Do you see this as a problem for attracting the talent?
Yes, it is. I've now been working at the UNPRI for 2 years. So when I worked for Oxfam, my salary was maybe 1/3, between a quarter and 1/3 of what I was paid before in a bank. And now at UNPRI, it's about half. And I'm still adjusting my lifestyle. Like I can't buy things that I used to be able to buy. You know, I can't go on holidays and stay in nice hotels that I used to be able to stay in. So it is unfortunately a lifestyle, a little bit of a trade-off. And because of this, I do find that not as many people who really want to come into sustainability, they look at the paycheck and they said, oh, they can't, or, you know, they have family commitments or mortgage commitments or, you know, school fees that they have to pay. So I do find that it is somehow a barrier, unfortunately.
Sadly. But within finance, there are obviously sustainability roles within the traditional financial institutions that would pay.
Yes. So I think there are people, I mean, who gain experience at organizations such as ours and then move back into finance or move into finance afterwards. So that is an option.
And also for you, a question more about sustainable investing as opposed to the sustainability linked careers. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. It could be one of my colleagues in finance, another finance professor asking, are interested SDG investors pursuing the outcomes, the SDG outcomes, because it's the right thing to do, or because there's solid evidence that being socially responsible helps long-term risk management and the bottom line?
It really varies. I mean, from the kind of ethical investors or religious-based investors, because it's the right thing to do. For pension fund managers, they do see alignment between, they do believe that financial return will also be matched by the investments they make based on outcomes. For example, if you invest in a company that's serving the needs of people, whether it's health or education, that should lead to better economic growth, and that would be better for your portfolio performance at the macro level. So particularly for universal owners, so pension funds that own the global, what they're interested in is not one particular company outperforming the other. They want the whole economy and societies to grow. So from that perspective, SDGs, if we achieve the SDGs, economies and world should grow. If we don't achieve the SDGs, the economies won't grow as much. So from that perspective, they have a financial reason to invest in SDGs.
Great. I hope that answered the question of the audience member.
And just to add to that, it's also there is a generally correlation in terms of best practices, and so best companies tend to be good at everything, right? So they anticipate the indicators, the drivers of future success, and therefore many of them have embraced the SDGs and sort of sustainability at large earlier than others, and demonstrating the differentiation and the potential impact. So it's not only the question of risk, which is sort of typical driver, but it's also the fact that it does sort of align with driving best performance across multiple dimensions, and that applies to marketing, to and the values of a brand. That applies to the efficiency of the supply chain, because if you have an efficient supply chain, efficient procurement, you're likely to be sort of better off also in terms of your carbon emissions, or at least your ability to monitor carbon throughout your value chain. These kind of drivers.
Absolutely. Yeah, so sustainability really is linked closely to the value drivers of the business, and therefore value in the long run. Bruno, a question for you. So as you work with companies, obviously you must have encountered many people who have titles that now have sustainability in them. So kind of new roles within traditional businesses, sustainability directors, or even at the C-suite level, a chief sustainability officer. So what is your opinion on these types of new roles in otherwise kind of traditional businesses?
So the role of chief sustainability officer has really developed over the last 15 years. So I've seen them blossom with a variety of form. Again, I'll go back to my analogy. I think they are ambassadors. They are, let's say, the internal priests of sustainability within the organization. What has really changed over the last 15 years is now you can sort of see that coming into more specific technical roles by either sort of function or specific industry, right? So now you have specialists of that topic in procurement at an industry level, because if you're in cosmetics, for example, many of the issues related to testing, related to the sourcing, can have a huge impact on your reputation, as well as on the value of the brands as seen by your customer. And so typically you're going to have people specializing along the entire sort of supply chain to address a particular topic, to go all the way back to the suppliers wherever they are, somewhere in emerging markets very often, to understand if the conditions of production, if the sustainability or let's say sort of circularity of that particular component is being addressed, guaranteed, etc. So that's what I was sort of saying in at the beginning. What I find super interesting now is that you can really sort of combine a very specific focus around a function, around a role, around an industry, with a sustainability orientation. Typically in the post-COVID environment, I think there's very new issues. That's why I was talking about this sort of enlargement towards business responsibility related to localization of employment, localization therefore of production, which is part of those sort of responsible trends for many organizations, which means that you can play many different roles with that particular focus. But yeah, I'm still going to answer the question. I think CSOs continue to be very important. They prepare that sort of external reporting. Very often they get now involved in the communication with the markets, with the financial analyst. The analysts are becoming much more sort of aware. So very often they deep dive directly into the KPIs of the organization without using the agencies as intermediate, which means that the CSO is under sort of huge scrutiny. They have to be able to respond to any kind of crisis or help the CEO respond to any kind of crisis. So that role has developed, has become much more strategic, and that is very good for most organizations. And from let's say a consulting standpoint, I think the spread of activities that have a sort of sustainability component, therefore that are attractive to particularly the young people who join us, has increased dramatically, and I think that's a very positive sort of outcome of the last 15 years.
Maybe related to this question, if we look at boards, how well educated, how knowledgeable are boards on sustainability issues, and what impact does that have on companies?
I think it's it depends. The classic sort of normal answers. It depends on the industry. So I think there is a number of industries where boards are extremely aware, either because of the risk. If you're in the mining sector, you know that the sustainability risk is huge, right? So if you have a good chief risk officer, he has informed the board that an accident on a particular site can have tremendous impact on the reputation of a company. Let's say Vale, for example, in South America. If you are in the marketing space, in consumer goods, I think there is a much deeper understanding today that the expectation of the consumer has changed, and that a consumer is asking those sort of new values out of any brand, i.e. that they have the lesser impact on the environment, that they have thought about all the issues related to circularity, to efficiency, reusable packaging, etc., right? So these are environment where sort of it's fairly normal and classic. I think in some other industries it took more time, but I would say that overall, and I think Kerry can comment on the work with the World Business Council. I think when I was part of that organization 15 years ago, it was really driven by the resources industries, because that's where the issues were coming from. Initially, these were the industries where they had a major problem related to the fact that they were sort of emitting an enormous amount of CO2. I would say that now the representation of those organizations has become much more horizontal across all industries. And I would say that most boards now have identified in their board someone who is in charge of those issues, not necessarily sort of exclusively, but in the recruiting of boards, I think having someone with that kind of profile is more and more necessary.
Great, thank you very much. We're down to our last 4 or 5 minutes, so I'm just going to hand to Kaori if you have some final thoughts that you want to share with us. I know my last 2 questions were both to Bruno. You're muted.
So maybe I will finish with my wish, maybe for the students and also for the professors. So for the students, I really believe that after having worked in Lima and Nomura, like unless the client demands change, the financial institutions or companies don't change. So my wish is that everyone, when they leave today's session, if you have a pension plan, log into your pension plan, and if and look at your portfolio to see if your pension plan offers a sustainability option, and maybe ask them questions on sustainability issues, like what does their what's their state, what's their view on Paris Agreement and aligning their portfolio with the Paris Agreement, etc. Whatever you are interested in, because not enough pension fund providers get this request from individuals, and therefore it doesn't it only takes a couple of requests to make a huge impact for these organizations. So that's one. And the second request is I really wish that a clever academic will come up with a new alternative to discounted cash flow model of valuing companies, so that longer term investments will be incentivized.
Thank you very much. So we're going to wrap up here. So there are still 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A chat window. They all relate to sustainable finance, so about the key drivers that make sustainability affect financial performance, ESG indices. These are all topics that are actually covered in my elective, so I'll be very happy to take these questions offline and encourage, if these are students, to take that elective in P4. With that, I would like to very much thank Kaori and Bruno for their time today and for their insights on this topic of careers in sustainability and climate change. I'd like to thank the organizers, which were the students that together make up the Climate Action Student Club, who really got this thing together behind the scenes. I'd like to thank Accenture Strategy, who is our partner in the INSEAD SDG Week this year. And then behind the scenes, the operations team, and obviously HGIBS for organizing this whole week of events. And talking of the whole week of events, we still have 3 more coming up tomorrow. So please do register, do tune back in for the 5th, 6th and final sessions of the INSEAD SDG Week 2020. Okay, with that, I will close. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Here are ways to stay connected. Goodbye, stay healthy, stay sane.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.